Welcome Year 12s to this video on plea negotiations. There are 4 things that you need to do while you're listening to this video. The first thing is to take the very best Cornell notes that you can. The second thing is to use the pause and rewind functions. Use the pause function if you want to stop this video so that you can take notes. Use the rewind function so that you can rewind this video if you've missed any information and you want to go back over that information. The third thing that you need to do is have your vocabulary sheets open in front of you so that you can include in your vocabulary sheets important definitions, as well as the definitions of any words that you might not be familiar with. And the fourth thing that you need to do is have your summary books open in front of you. As we go through this video, I will give you guidance as to what you should include in your summary books. Once you've finished watching this video, there is one thing that you need to do, and that is to read the pages of the textbook referred to on this slide. If you find any additional information from that reading that you think is useful, then supplement your notes with that information. Well, let's get started then. Here are the 2 learning intentions for this video. Please make sure that you write these learning intentions down in your Cornell notes. The first learning intention is that you should be able to explain the purposes of plea negotiations in determining criminal cases. The purpose of this video is to help you to achieve this learning intention. The second learning intention is that you should be able to apply your knowledge of the purposes of plea negotiations to discuss the appropriateness of plea negotiations, including in the context of different case studies. In class, I will give you a number of case studies that will enable you to practice applying your knowledge of plea negotiations. Once you have done these case studies, then hopefully you will have achieved this second learning intention. On this slide, I have set out a definition of plea negotiations. In your vocabulary sheet, find the term plea negotiations and write this definition in there. Plea negotiations are pre-trial discussions that take place between the prosecution and the accused, and which are aimed at resolving a criminal case by agreeing on the charges that the accused will plead guilty to. Once you've written this definition in your vocabulary sheet, highlight the words which are in red, bold, and italic type. There are 3 important points that you need to remember about this definition of plea negotiations. First, plea negotiations are pre-trial discussions. That is, they are discussions that take place before the accused has their hearing in the magistrate's court, where the accused has been charged with a summary offence, or their trial in the county court or trial division of the Supreme Court, where the accused has been charged with an indictable offence. Second, these discussions are between the prosecution and the accused. They do not in any way involve a magistrate, judge or jury, or the victim. Third, the focus of plea negotiations is on the prosecution and the accused agreeing the charges to which the accused will plead guilty. Plea negotiations are not negotiations about the sentence that will be imposed on the accused for the offences with which the accused has been charged. It is entirely up to the magistrate, in the case of a summary offence, or the judge, in the case of an indictable offence, to determine the sentence to impose on the accused for those charges to which the accused has agreed to plead guilty as a result of any plea negotiations with the prosecution. Now, I will be referring to these pre-trial discussions as plea negotiations, and that's the term that I would like you to use in writing any answers to SACs or exams. However, you should also be aware that plea negotiations are sometimes referred to as charge negotiations or plea bargaining. Assuming that a plea negotiation is successful in the sense that the prosecution and the accused are able to agree on the charges to which the accused will plead guilty, then there are 2 possible outcomes of that plea negotiation. The first is that the accused might agree to plead guilty to fewer charges than the prosecution has charged the accused with. What this means is that the accused will agree to plead guilty to some charges if the prosecution drops other charges against the accused. The second possible outcome of a plea negotiation is that the accused pleads guilty to a lesser offence than the offence with which the accused has been charged. By lesser offence, we mean an offence that has a lower maximum penalty. So, for example, where an accused has been charged with murder, the accused and the prosecution might instead agree that the accused will plead guilty to manslaughter. In the case of murder, the maximum penalty is life imprisonment, but in the case of manslaughter, the maximum penalty is 25 years imprisonment. So you can see that, in this case, this is an example of an accused pleading guilty to a lesser offence. Plea negotiations apply to both summary offences and indictable offences. This means that, where the accused has been charged with one or more summary offences, then the prosecution and the accused can agree on the summary offences that the accused will plead guilty to. In such a case, it will be a magistrate in the magistrate's court that sentences the accused for the summary offences to which the accused has agreed to plead guilty as a result of the accused's plea negotiations with the prosecution. Similarly, where the accused has been charged with one or more indictable offences, then the prosecution and the accused can agree on the indictable offences that the accused will plead guilty to. In such a case, it will be a judge in either the county court or the trial division of the Supreme Court who sentences the accused for the indictable offences to which the accused has agreed to plead guilty as a result of the accused's plea negotiations with the prosecution. Plea negotiations are also without prejudice. This means that any offers made by the prosecution to the accused or by the accused to the prosecution during plea negotiations cannot be used against that party. That is, cannot be used as evidence against that party in a trial in the county court or the trial division of the Supreme Court or in a hearing in the magistrate's court. For example, if an accused is charged with murder and, in a plea negotiation, offers to plead guilty to manslaughter instead, but the prosecution refuses to agree to the accused pleading guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter, then the prosecution cannot subsequently introduce evidence of the accused's offer to plead guilty to manslaughter in the trial of the accused for murder. Put another way, the prosecution can't say in the accused's trial for murder that the accused must have killed the victim because the accused was prepared to plead guilty to a charge of manslaughter. You'll recall that our first learning intention is that you need to be able to explain the purposes of plea negotiations in determining criminal cases. There are three purposes of plea negotiations. You need to know and be able to explain each of these purposes. In the next few slides, I will explain what these three purposes are. Please draw up a table like the table on this slide in your summary book. I've set out the three purposes of plea negotiations in the left-hand column of this table. After listening to my explanation of these three purposes, you must summarize the explanation for each purpose in the right-hand column of this table. Make sure that you leave sufficient room in the right-hand column of your table to summarize this explanation. As I've said, there are three purposes of plea negotiations. The first purpose of plea negotiations is to ensure certainty of the outcome of a criminal case. If an accused pleads guilty as a result of a plea negotiation, then all that remains is for the magistrate or judge to sentence the accused. On the other hand, if the accused's case went to trial in the county court or trial division of the Supreme Court or to a hearing in the magistrate's court, then there is the possibility that the accused might not be found guilty. That's because a jury in the county court or the trial division of the Supreme Court or a magistrate in the magistrate's court might not be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that the accused actually committed the offence and therefore acquits the accused. As a result of the accused pleading guilty due to a plea negotiation, the victim and the community have certainty that the accused will receive at least some punishment, albeit for a less serious offence, because there is then no risk of the accused being totally acquitted. However, it is very important that any lesser offence to which the accused pleads guilty as a result of a plea negotiation is still an offence that adequately reflects the seriousness of the accused's criminal behaviour. For example, it would generally be inappropriate if an accused was charged with murder, but the prosecution and the accused then agreed that instead the accused would plead guilty to common assault. This is because murder is a very serious crime which carries a maximum of life imprisonment, whereas common assault is a much less serious crime that might or might not result in the accused being sent to jail. One criticism that is sometimes made of plea negotiations is that they may be seen as letting the accused off by permitting the accused to plead guilty to a lesser charge. If victims and the community have this perception of plea negotiations, then there is the risk that the public will lose confidence in our criminal justice system. It's for this reason that any lesser offence that the accused pleads guilty to as part of a plea negotiation must still adequately reflect the accused's criminal behaviour. The second purpose of plea negotiations is to save the costs, time and resources of a trial or hearing. Criminal trials and hearings are very costly. This is particularly because both the prosecution and the accused will generally be represented by lawyers, and lawyers are very expensive. Criminal trials and hearings are also likely to be time-consuming, at least where they involve a lot of evidence, for example, as where there are a large number of witnesses in a case. And criminal trials and hearings take up the resources of the courts. In the magistrate's court, you need a magistrate, and in the county court and the trial division of the Supreme Court, you need a judge and jury, as well as additional court staff such as a stenographer, a judge's associate, and a judge's tipstaff. However, where an accused pleads guilty as a result of a plea negotiation, there is no hearing in the magistrate's court or no trial in the county court or trial division of the Supreme Court, and so there is a saving of the costs, time and resources of a trial or hearing. The third and last purpose of plea negotiations is to promptly resolve a criminal case without the stress, trauma, and inconvenience of a trial or hearing. Trials and hearings can be stressful and traumatic for the victim and any witnesses because, at a trial or hearing, they will relive the offending through having to sit through the case and through having to give evidence. A trial or hearing is also inconvenient because it takes up the time of the victim and any witnesses in having to attend to the trial or hearing to give evidence. However, where an accused pleads guilty as a result of a plea negotiation, there is no hearing in the magistrate's court or no trial in the county court or trial division of the Supreme Court, and so the victim and witnesses are not exposed to the stress, trauma, and inconvenience of a trial or hearing. In addition, the victim obtains early closure. This is because, instead of having to await the outcome of a trial or hearing, the victim knows that the accused has pleaded guilty and that the accused will receive some kind of punishment. You'll recall that our second learning intention is that you should be able to apply your knowledge of the purposes of plea negotiations to discuss the appropriateness of plea negotiations, including in the context of different case studies. In the next 2 slides, I will explain what the factors are that the prosecution should take into account in deciding whether it's appropriate to enter into and conclude plea negotiations with an accused person. Please draw up a table like the table on this slide in your summary book. I've set out the relevant factors in the left-hand column of this table. After listening to my explanation of these 6 factors, you must summarize the explanation for each factor in the right-hand column of this table. Make sure that you leave sufficient room in the right-hand column of your table to summarize this explanation. As I've said in this slide and the next slide, we are going to look at those factors that the prosecution should take into account in deciding whether it is appropriate to enter into and conclude plea negotiations with an accused person. The overarching principle is that the prosecution should only enter into and conclude plea negotiations with an accused person if that is in the public interest and appropriate for the particular case. Now, in deciding whether plea negotiations are in the public interest and appropriate for the particular case, the prosecution needs to consider 6 factors. These factors are set out in the policy of the Director of Public Prosecutions on resolution. If ever you are asked to discuss the appropriateness of plea negotiations in the context of a case study, then you need to consider these 6 factors. Let's go through these factors now. The first factor is whether the accused is willing to cooperate in the investigation or prosecution of any co-offenders, that is, people who have committed the crime with the accused, or of offenders who have committed other crimes. For example, suppose that Bill and Max have broken into a house and threatened the family living there with a gun. Let's also suppose that the police have arrested and charged Bill with aggravated burglary, that is, burglary using a weapon, in this case the gun, but that they have not yet caught Max. The fact that Bill is willing to give evidence against Max when Max is caught and tried is a factor that would justify the prosecution agreeing to Bill pleading guilty to the lesser charge of burglary and not the more serious charge of aggravated burglary. The second factor that the prosecution needs to take into account in deciding whether to enter into and conclude plea negotiations with an accused person is the strength of the prosecution case, including the admissibility of important evidence, the credibility of key witnesses, and any possible defences that the accused might have. For example, suppose that Philip has been charged with raping Alana, but that Philip's defence is that Alana consented to them having sexual intercourse. The fact that Philip has a possible defence, that is, that Alana consented to the sexual intercourse, is a factor that would justify the prosecution agreeing to Philip pleading guilty to the lesser charge of sexual assault and not to the more serious charge of rape. From the prosecution's point of view, it is better that Philip pleads guilty to a lesser offence and receives at least some punishment, rather than that Philip's case goes to trial, his defence of consent succeeds, and Philip is totally acquitted with no punishment at all. The third factor that the prosecution should take into account when deciding whether to enter into and conclude plea negotiations with an accused person is whether the charges to which the accused is willing to plead guilty adequately reflect the accused's criminality and allow for the imposition of an appropriate sentence. As I've already explained, where an accused is charged with murder, it would generally be inappropriate for the prosecution to agree to the accused pleading guilty to a charge of common assault. This is because murder is a very serious crime that is punishable by a maximum penalty of life imprisonment, whereas common assault is a much less serious crime. On the other hand, where an accused is charged with murder, it might well be appropriate for the prosecution to agree to the accused pleading guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter. While murder carries a maximum punishment of life imprisonment, manslaughter carries a maximum punishment of 25 years imprisonment, and it may well be that, in the circumstances of the victim's death, the prosecution believes that a jail sentence of, say, 20 years would be appropriate. In this case, the accused's plea of guilty to manslaughter would adequately reflect the accused's criminality. The accused has, after all, killed another person, and it would also allow for the imposition of an appropriate sentence, in this case, say, 20 years imprisonment, although that, of course, would be a matter for the judge. The fourth factor that the prosecution should take into account when deciding whether to enter into and conclude plea negotiations with an accused person is whether any witnesses that are required for the prosecution case are reluctant or unwilling to give evidence. For example, suppose that Jack, a well-known and violent gang leader, is charged with robbing a bank with a gun, and that a witness sees Jack running out of the bank with a case full of cash. It may well be that the witness is too frightened of Jack and his gang to give evidence against Jack at Jack's trial, and that's because he's afraid that Jack's gang will take revenge on him. This would be a situation in which it might be appropriate for the prosecution to agree to Jack pleading guilty to the lesser charge of robbery and not to continue charging Jack with the more serious charge of aggravated burglary, that is, robbery with a weapon, in this case a gun. From the prosecution's point of view, it is better that Jack pleads guilty to a lesser offence and receives at least some punishment, rather than that Jack's case goes to trial, the witness refuses to testify, and Jack is totally acquitted with no punishment at all. The fifth factor that the prosecution should take into account in deciding whether to enter into and conclude plea negotiations with an accused is the possible disadvantages of a full trial or hearing. As I've already explained, trials and hearings can be extremely stressful and traumatic for the victim and any witnesses. For example, going back to the case where Philip is charged with raping Alana, Alana might suffer significant trauma in giving evidence at Philip's trial, because in giving evidence she will be reliving the traumatic experience of the rape that has been committed against her. This would be a situation in which it might be appropriate for the prosecution to agree to Philip pleading guilty to the lesser charge of sexual assault. The alternative would be to cause Alana much more trauma by subjecting her to a full trial at which she would have to give evidence and at which she would be exposed to cross-examination by Philip's lawyer. In addition, again, as I've already explained, trials and hearings are costly and time-consuming. So, for instance, where the offence is relatively minor, it might be considered a waste of money and time to have a full trial or hearing. For example, let's suppose that Ali is charged with theft because he has been arrested with 50 packets of cigarettes that he stolen from a milk bar. And let's suppose that Ali is arrested while he's trying to sell those packets of cigarettes to Kate. This would be a situation in which it might be appropriate for the prosecution to agree to Ali pleading guilty to the lesser charge of disposing of stolen goods rather than the more serious charge of theft. In such a case, whilst Ali shouldn't have stolen the 50 packets of cigarettes from the milk bar, that is a fairly minor offence, and the prosecution could probably take the view that it is better to avoid the time and expense of a full trial for such an offence. Conversely, suppose that Brian, an accountant, has been charged with embezzling $20 million from his clients, but that the evidence required to prove this charge is very detailed and very technical because Brian has used a series of offshore bank accounts to hide that money in. As a result of this, it may be that the trial is likely to take a number of months, simply because of the amount of evidence that the prosecution needs to present at the trial. This would be a situation where it might be appropriate for the prosecution to agree to Brian pleading guilty to the lesser charge of theft and therefore avoiding such a long trial. The sixth and final factor that the prosecution should take into account in deciding whether to enter into and conclude plea negotiations with an accused person is the victim's views. Now note, however, that the victim's views are not determinative. That is, the prosecution doesn't have to do what the victim wants. For example, let's suppose that Felicia is charged with murdering Ken, but that Felicia is willing to plead guilty to manslaughter. It may be that Ken's family, who, because Ken is dead, are considered to be the victims, it may be that Ken's family really wants Felicia prosecuted for murder because they think that Felicia needs to pay a very high price for killing Ken. In such a case, it would be appropriate for the prosecution to take the views of Ken's family into account in deciding whether or not to agree to Felicia pleading guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter. Indeed, as you already know, the victim's charter requires the Director of Public Prosecutions to seek the views of a victim before the Director of Public Prosecutions accepts a plea of guilty to a lesser charge or to substantially change the charges against the accused. The victim's charter also requires the Director of Public Prosecutions to give reasons to the victim for any such decision. However, while the prosecution must take the views of Ken's family as the victims into account, the prosecution is not required to follow those views, and it could properly decide, perhaps because of other factors that we've looked at, that it is appropriate to agree to Felicia pleading guilty to the charge of manslaughter rather than to prosecuting Felicia for murder. When you are writing an answer to a SAC or exam question in which you are required to discuss the appropriateness of plea negotiations in the context of a case study, it's important that your answer doesn't just summarize the case study. For example, by saying that a plea negotiation is appropriate because a prosecution witness, Jack, is afraid of William the accused, and the victim, Tiffany, risks being traumatized by a trial. Instead, I suggest that you adopt the answer structure set out on this slide, which we'll be practicing in class. First, state your opinion as to whether a plea negotiation is or is not appropriate. The question is asking you whether a plea negotiation is appropriate, and so you must directly answer the question. If you think a plea negotiation is appropriate, you could write your opinion as, in my opinion, a plea negotiation would be appropriate in this case because it is in the public interest for the prosecution to agree to the accused pleading guilty to a less serious offence. If you think that a plea negotiation is not appropriate, then your opinion would be the opposite. In my opinion, a plea negotiation would not be appropriate in this case because it is not in the public interest for the prosecution to agree to the accused pleading guilty to a less serious offence. Second, if you think that a plea negotiation is appropriate, then in the next paragraph, explain the factors that favour a plea negotiation. In the context of the case study that you've been given, your topic sentence for this paragraph will be something such as, there are X factors in favour of a plea negotiation in this case. You can then deal with each of these factors in turn. Third, this should be followed by a separate paragraph in which you explain the factors against a plea negotiation in the context of the case study. To show that you are discussing the for and against factors, use a word or words of weighing up, such as however or on the other hand. The topic sentence for this paragraph would be something like, there are X factors against a plea negotiation in this case. You can then deal with each of these factors in turn. Fourth, because there will generally be some factors in favour of a plea negotiation and some factors against a plea negotiation, your final paragraph should conclude with words such as, overall, I think that a plea negotiation would be appropriate because, following which you will give the main reason for your opinion. Now, If you think that a plea negotiation is not appropriate in the context of the case study that you've been given, then you'll just reverse the order of the paragraphs so that after you've given your opinion that a plea negotiation would not be appropriate, the first paragraph explains the factors against a plea negotiation. The second paragraph explains the factors in favour of a plea negotiation, and the third paragraph is the overall paragraph where you come to an overall conclusion, giving a reason as to why a plea negotiation would not be appropriate in the context of the case study. As I've said, when you're answering this kind of question, it is very important that you don't just summarise the case study. To avoid doing this, when you deal with a relevant factor, I suggest that you start off with a sentence that sets out the general principle, that is, that describes the relevant factor in general terms, and that you then follow this with a sentence or sentences that apply that general principle using the facts of the case study. I've illustrated how you can do this on this slide and the next slide. The general structure is the first factor is dot, in this case dot dot dot. The second factor is dot, in this case dot dot dot. You can see that each factor is described in general terms, and then that factor is specifically related to the case study facts. For example, when analysing the factors in favour of a plea negotiation, we might write that the first factor is the willingness of the accused to cooperate in the investigation or prosecution of co-offenders or of offenders in other crimes. This is a description of the general principle. We then follow that with a sentence such as, in this case, Jane is willing to give evidence against Felicity, who held up the bank with her. This is a sentence in which we are applying the general principle to the case study facts. Similarly, if we are analysing the factors against a plea negotiation, we might write that the first factor is whether the charges to which the accused is willing to plead guilty adequately reflect the accused's criminality and allow for the imposition of an appropriate sentence. This is a description of the general principle. We might then write a sentence such as, in this case, Edward has been charged with murder, which has a maximum sentence of a life imprisonment, and so the lesser charge of assault does not properly reflect the seriousness of what Edward has done by deliberately killing Frank. This is an example of how you might apply the general principle to the case study facts. I suggest that you carefully review this slide and the previous two slides to familiarise yourself with this approach. On this slide, I've included some tips that you should remember about plea negotiations. First, plea negotiations are only relevant to criminal cases, not to civil cases. There are no plea negotiations in a civil case. Second, plea negotiations are pre-trial discussions. That is, they occur before the trial or hearing of an accused has begun. Third, plea negotiations are between the prosecution and the accused. They do not involve a magistrate, judge or jury or the victim. Fourth, plea negotiations are negotiations about the charges against the accused. Plea negotiations are negotiations between the prosecution and the accused about whether the accused will plead guilty to a fewer number of charges or to less serious charges. Plea negotiations are not negotiations about the accused's sentence. It is the role of the magistrate or judge to decide the sentence that is to be imposed on an accused who agrees to plead guilty as a result of a plea negotiation. It is not for the prosecution and the accused to try to agree that sentence themselves. And fifth and finally, plea negotiations apply to both summary and indictable offences. That is, they apply to offences that are heard in the magistrate's court, namely summary offences, and to offences that are heard in the county court or the trial division of the Supreme Court, namely indictable offences. Well, that brings us to the end of this video. You should now be able to explain the purposes of plea negotiations in determining criminal cases. Remember that there are three purposes. In addition, you should now have the knowledge to discuss the appropriateness of plea negotiations, including in the context of different case studies. That's a reference to the 6 factors that the prosecution needs to take into account when it's deciding whether to enter into and conclude plea negotiations with an accused person. However, to help you fully achieve this second learning intention, in class I will be giving you a number of case studies and you will need to write an analysis of these case studies in which you discuss the appropriateness of plea negotiations in the context of those case studies. In addition, in class, we'll be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of plea negotiations so that you can then discuss or evaluate the effectiveness of plea negotiations in achieving their purposes. Now, remember that there's one last thing that you need to do, and that is to read the pages from the textbook referred to in the first slide. If you find any information from that reading that you think is useful, please make sure that you include that information in your Cornell notes. Thank you very much for your attention.